He returns to us at the top of his game with another wonderful tale, gorgeously told and easily my favorite book of the past couple of years. Sentence by sentence, word by word, it's a pleasure to at once be wrapped by the story and simultaneously appreciate the craftsmanship, poetry, and economy of the language. I realize that sounds like I could be talking about a book I haven't read yet, but I've read it. But I'm only up to page 90, so don't give away anything. So in the interest of brevity, please join me in welcoming Michael Chabon.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for coming out. Hi. I'm very happy to be here. Philadelphia is the first city where I ever did an event in a bookstore and enough people showed up that I didn't feel bad. I'm always will be grateful, and I'm happy to see lots of smiling faces when I come to Philadelphia. And Philadelphia is also a city that I have strong personal and family connections to, and I made use of those connections and that history in Moonglow. For the first time, I dug into the whole Philadelphia story, if you will, of my family. And so I thought I would read a section from the book that is the most Philadelphia part of the book. There used to be more Philadelphia in this book, but I cut out just before, after I submitted to the publisher, and they were all good with it, then I decided to cut out this one section that is set almost entirely in Philly, because it just didn't, it's a good story, I think, but it's really kind of a freestanding thing. It didn't add anything to what happened subsequently, so I thought I better just cut it. If you're interested, if you like this book, the New York Times published it on their website a couple weeks ago. It's called a story called The Sandmeyer Reaction. So it's there if you want to see, and that's super Philly. It's got a lot of, I really got into it. And I'm also happy to say that I believe a gentleman named Murray Dubin is in the audience tonight, and he wrote a book about South Philadelphia, a really great kind of a portrait of historical South Philadelphia, especially in the earlier part of the 20th century, and not just Jewish South Philly, but the whole neighborhood. And I leaned on him very heavily in trying to make my Philly plausible. So it was exciting to get to meet him tonight. I thought also I'd just read this one little thing. It's on my phone, which is sort of a weird thing to read from. But and talk a little bit about my Uncle Stanley. Stanley Werbo was my great uncle. He was my grandmother's brother, and he was my favorite relative in that generation, I would say. He was a scholar. He was a professor and a scholar of medieval German. He taught at the University of Texas. He was the dean of humanities there. He was also fluent in Yiddish. He spoke fluent modern German as well, and it was that latter skill that made him a recruit to the Army intelligence during World War II. He used to say he was a spy. I don't know what he really did exactly. He was in signal intelligence at Monte Cassino, and he was a big influence on me in many ways, but especially with this book. Just before he died, not long before, he dictated some memories to his daughter, one of his daughters, and she wrote them down, and just after he died, she sent me this 15, 20-page document of his recollections of growing up here and in Washington, D.C., and I leaned very heavily on those as well. And I just thought I'd just read one little short paragraph just so you could hear, those of you, maybe some of you will connect. He said, and this is just pretty much verbatim, I believe, I remember Saturday night supper at my Uncle Mike Moonblatt's house on Marshall Street in East Philadelphia. Uncle Mike was a milkman, the old-fashioned kind. I don't remember whether he delivered milk with a horse and wagon or not, but I do know that he made his own cottage cheese. I can just see the cheesecloth sack with the whey dripping whatever the liquid is called. But that is not what I wanted to talk about. And he goes on, he continually interrupts himself and comes up with further cousins and uncles and memories. And I just wanted to read this one other thing that's stuck in my mind. Where is it? Forgive me. You'll hear this again. It's the very last thing he says. I remember what a primitive washing machine my poor mother had, with a wringer on it, and which emptied into the bathtub, and how she lugged the wet laundry up the wooden stairs to hang them to dry, and how the clothes froze stiff on cold winter days. She deserved a medal. Anyway, maybe a little shadow of some of that will turn up in what I'm reading you tonight. As a boy, my grandfather lived with his parents, his father's father, and his kid brother, Reynard, my mother's Uncle Ray, in 3 rooms at the corner of 10th and Shunk in South Philadelphia. His father, a German-speaking native of Pressburg, now Bratislava, had failed in a series of dry goods stores and corner groceries throughout the 1920s and 30s. After that, he abandoned hope of enduring ownership and played out the string as a sales clerk in liquor stores, watching other men's cash registers get robbed. In my grandfather's recollections, his mother appeared as a strong back and a heart of gold, a saint indentured to the service of her husband and sons. In photographs, she is a boxy woman, girdled with steel, shod in coal-black stompers. Her bosom so large it might have housed turbines. She was all but illiterate in Yiddish and English, but obliged my grandfather and later Uncle Ray to read to her daily from the Yiddish press so that she could keep abreast of the latest calamities to beset Jewry. From every week's household budget, she managed to siphon off $1 or $2 for the pushki can. Orphans of pogrom were fed, refugees birthed on steamships to freedom. Entire hillsides in Palestine bore the oranges of her compassionate embezzlement. In winter, the laundry froze stiff on the clothesline, my grandfather recalled. She had to carry it up all those stairs. Uncle Ray I knew as a playboy of the late 1960s, in a sky blue turtleneck and a gray tweed blazer. He drove an Alpha Spider and wore a raffish eye patch over his gnarly left eye. Sometimes when I looked at him, I thought of Hugh Hefner, and sometimes of Moshe Dayan. As a boy, however, Reynard was studious and frail. It was my grandfather, in the early days, who ran wild. Throwing a kitten out of a window was only a warning shot. That's a reference to the first recollection we hear from the grandfather in this book is of dropping a kitten out of a window just to see what would happen when he was about 4, which is something that my actual grandfather told me that he had done just before he died. He wandered in the summertime from breakfast to dark, ranging as far east as the rancid Delaware and as far south as the Navy Yard. He saw an evicted family drinking tea on the sidewalk amid their beds, their lamps, their Victrola, a parakeet in a brass cage. He unfolded a packet of newspaper on the lid of an ash can and found the eyeball of a cow. He saw children and animals beaten savagely and yet with patience and care. He saw a convertible Nash mobbed outside an AME church. Marian Anderson stepped out of it and lit up his memory 6 decades afterward with the crescent moon of her smile. South Philadelphia was broadcast with Moonblatts and Newmans, those cousins who one day would people the weddings and funerals of my mother's and my childhoods. Their homes served as my grandfather's way stations. In threading his routes from one to the next, past blocks controlled by Irish and Italians, my grandfather laid the foundation of his wartime work. He cultivated secret contacts among the Italian bakers and grocers, running errands or working a broom in exchange for payment in pennies, lemon ice, or a twist of warm bread. He studied the nuances of people's ways of speaking and carrying themselves. If you hoped to avoid a beating on Christian Street, you could alter your gait and the cant of your head to look as though you were walking where you belonged. When that failed, or if, like my grandfather, you were not averse to scrapping, you fought dirty. Even Christian Street bravos squealed like babies if you hooked your thumbs in their eye sockets. Every so often, on the slope of a train embankment behind the breast-shaped silos of the fertilizer plant, a battle would be pitched with bed slats, lengths of pipe, slingshots, and rocks. My grandfather lost a tooth, broke an arm, took uncountable stitches. On his left buttock, he bore a pouty scar, the work of a beer bottle he sat on during a fight in a vacant lot behind the McCann sugar refinery. 60 years later, the scar was visible whenever he used the bedpan, a silvery pucker, the kiss of violence. His absences and injuries caused consternation to his parents, who made efforts to curtail them. Bounds were set, borders established. My grandfather subverted them. Resolute in his refusal to give details or name names, resistant to corporal punishment, willing to forego whatever treat he was to be deprived of, he wore his parents down. In time, they surrendered. "Nothing can be done about a boy who throws cats out of windows," said old Abraham, my grandfather's grandfather, in his Pressburger German. Abraham ruled from his corner of the parlor that doubled as a dining room, enthroned atop his hemorrhoid donut, among his books of commentary. It was nearly dark, one of the last free evenings of the summer. "But what if he's lost?" my grandmother said for the 1,000th or millionth time. "He isn't lost," Uncle Ray said, issuing the finding that ultimately prevailed in the family Talmud. "He knows where he is." He was trapped under a train car, one of 6 wooden boxcars on a stub at the far end of a storage yard by the river. The boxcars were used last to rush Baldwin Felt's men to the Paint Creek mine war. Now they stood pastured against a hump of ground, and the mouths of a trumpet creeper devoured them. He was hiding from a railroad bull, a big man named Creasy, with a film on his left eye and patches of carroty hair growing on parts of his face where no hair ought to be. Creasy had already thrashed my grandfather soundly a number of times that summer. The first time, he jerked my grandfather's arm up behind his back so hard the bones sang. The second time, he dragged my grandfather by an earlobe across the yard to the main gate, where he applied his boot heel to the seat of my grandfather's trousers. My grandfather claimed the earlobe still bore the print of Creasy's thumb. The third time Creasy caught my grandfather trespassing, he strapped him thoroughly with the leather harness of his Pennsy uniform. This time, my grandfather planned to stay under that boxcar until Creasy moved on or dropped dead. Creasy stuck around, smoking cigarettes, pacing the weeds between the stub of track and the rest of the storage yard. My grandfather, flat on his belly, watched the bull's dusty boots through a scrim of dandelion and foxtail. Scrape, stop, pivot, return. Every few minutes, a cigarette fell with a pat against the gravel and met its end beneath Creasy's right boot. My grandfather heard the twist of a bottle cap, a slosh of liquid, a belch. He had the impression that Creasy was waiting for somebody, killing time, maybe getting up his nerve. My grandfather puzzled over it. Creasy was supposed to keep moving, sweeping the lots for hobos, tramps, and Pilferers like my grandfather, who had come to the Greenwich Yard that summer, drawn by reports of coal for the taking, spillover from the cars as they trundled to the piers. The first time Creasy caught him, it was because my grandfather had been weighed down by 25 pounds of coal in a sugar sack. Why did the man not carry on now with the work the Pennsylvania Railroad paid him to do? Inside the boxcar over his head, my grandfather heard small animals in their nests rousing themselves to their nightly business. According to his mother's natural history, he knew, that business was to bite young boys and give them rabies. At last, Creasy trampled his 5th cigarette, took another swig, and moved off. My grandfather counted to 30 and then slid out from under the boxcar. He brushed the grit from his belly where the skin prickled. He spotted Creasy carrying a knapsack, making for one of the little stucco houses scattered here and there across the lots. On his first forays into the Greenwich Yard, my grandfather had been charmed by the idea that railmen were cottaged like shepherds among the herded trains. He soon determined that the bungalows were no one's habitations. They had mesh grills over their black-washed windows, and if you put your ear to their doors, you could hear a thrum of power and sometimes a thunk like the clockwork of a bank vault. Until now, my grandfather had never seen anybody going into one or coming out. Creasy fished a key ring from his hip and let himself in. The door closed softly behind him. My grandfather knew that he ought to head for home, where a hot supper and an operetta of reproach awaited him. He was hungry and practiced in deafness and the formulation of remorse. But he had come here today to stand one final time at the top of one particular signal bridge that he had come to think of as his own and tell another summer goodbye. He cut across the storage yard and stole along a stretch of railbed to his signal bridge. He scaled the service ladder and clambered out along the catwalk to its midpoint, 15 feet above the tracks. He raised up, holding on to the body of the central signal lantern. He jammed his feet in their canvas sneakers into the steel lattice of the catwalk. He let go of the signal lantern and stood balanced with arms outspread, hooked only by his ankles to the turning earth. Between him and the tenement on Shunk Street, the rail yard shuffled and sorted its rolling stock, bound for New York, Pittsburgh, St. Louis. Trains and sections of trains clanged and rumbled and plowed furrows in the gloom. He turned his face to the east. Darkness piled up like a thunderhead over New Jersey. Beyond the river lay Camden, beyond Camden, the Jersey shore, beyond the shore, the Atlantic Ocean, and beyond that, Paris, France. His mother's brother, a veteran of the Argonne, had informed my grandfather that in the cat houses of that city, a man might cross one further border, where silk stocking met white thigh. My grandfather took the signal lantern in his arms. He pressed his hips against its smooth encasement and looked up at the evening sky. A full moon rose, tinted by its angle on Earth's atmosphere to a color like the flesh of a peach. My grandfather had spent most of that last Friday of the summer reading a copy of Astounding Stories of Super Science, found among some other unsold magazines in the back room of his father's store. The last story was about a daring Earthman who flew in an atomic rocket to the moon's dark side, where he found ample air and water, fought bloodthirsty Selenites, and fell in love with a pale and willing lunar princess. The moon was a tough neighborhood, and the princess required frequent salvation by the Earthman. My grandfather regarded the moon. He thought about the noble girl in the story with her graceful, undulating body, in quotes, and felt the swell of an inner tide reaching toward her, lifting him like Enoch in the whirlwind into the sky. He ascended the skyward tide of his longing. He would be there for her. He was coming to her rescue. A door banged shut, and Creasy came out of the little house and rejoined his evening route. He was no longer carrying the knapsack. He crossed a set of tracks, a hitch of stiffness in his walk, and vanished among the cars. My grandfather climbed down from the signal bridge. His path home did not run past the little house. But old Abraham had ruled correctly from his corner of the parlor. Nothing could be done for a boy who would throw a kitten out of the window onto a Philadelphia pavement just to see what would happen if he did. My grandfather approached the little house with its gridded black windows. For a full minute, he stood and watched it. He put his ear to the door. Over the electrical hum, he heard a human sound, choking or laughter or sobs. He knocked. The sound broke off. The house's mysterious clockwork clicked. From the marshalling yard came the trumpeting of lashed-up engines ready to drag a long load west. He knocked again. "Who's there?" My grandfather gave his first and last name. On reflection, he appended his address. There followed a prolonged spell of unmistakable coughing from the other side of the door. When it passed, he heard a stirring, the creak of a bed or chair. A girl peered out, hiding the right half of her face behind the door that she gripped with both hands, looking ready to slam it shut. The visible half of her head was a mat of peroxide tangles. Around the left eye, under a delicate eyebrow, paint mingled with mascara in cakes and blotches. She wore the fingernails of her left hand long, lacquered in black cherry. The nails on her right hand were bitten and bare of paint. She was wrapped loosely in a man's tartan bathrobe. If she was surprised to see him, she did not show it. If she had been crying, she was not crying anymore. But my grandfather understood Creasy the way you come to understand a man who repeatedly kicks your ass. The details of the hurt that Creasy might have done to this girl during his visit remained obscure, but my grandfather felt the outrage all the more vividly for his ignorance. He saw it in the ruin of her eye paint. He smelled it, a taint of Javello water and armpit in the air that leaked from behind the half-open door. "Well," she said, "state your business, Shunk Street." "I saw him come in there," my grandfather said, "that crazy bastard." It was not a word to be used in the hearing of adults, especially women, but in this instance it felt fitting. The girl's face came out from behind the door like the moon from behind a factory wall. She took a better look at him. "He is a bastard," she said. "You're right about that." He saw that the hair on the right side of her part was cropped as short as his own, as though to rid that half of lice. On the right side of her upper lip, she had raised enough whisker to form the handlebar of a mustache. Her right eye was free of paint under a dense black brow. Apart from a shadow of stubble universal on either side of the chin, an invisible rule appeared to have apportioned evenly the male and female of her nature. My grandfather had heard but disbelieved neighborhood reports of sideshow hermaphrodites, cat girls, ape girls, four-legged women who must be mounted like tables. He might have reconsidered his doubt if not for the fact that he saw, filling both sides of the loose flannel wrapper from the neck down, only womanly curvature and shadow. "The price of a peep is 1 nickel, Shunk Street," she said. "I believe you may owe me a dime." My grandfather looked down at his shoes. They were not much to look at. "Come on," he said, reaching for her arm. Even through the flannel of her sleeve, he could feel fever on her skin. She shook loose of his grip with a jerk of her arm. He won't come back this way for a while. Oh, sorry. Yeah, he won't come back this way for a while, but we have to go now, my grandfather said. There were whiskers on the chins of his own aunts. Big deal. Here he was, by the power of a wish on an evening star. Come on. Aren't you funny, she said. She peeked out of the doorway, looked to either side. She lowered her voice in a show of co-conspiracy, trying to rescue me. From her lips, it sounded like the most pea-brained idea ever conceived. She left the door hanging open and went back inside. She sat down on a cot and pulled a stiff blanket around her. In the light of a candle guttering on an overturned jar lid, panels of black switches and gauges glinted. Creasy's knapsack lay neglected on the floor. "Gonna take me home, dear Mama and Papa?" she suggested in a voice that made him momentarily dislike her. "A drug-sick whore full of TB? I could take you to a hospital." "Aren't you funny?" she said more tenderly this time. "You already know I can unlock the door from the inside, honey. I'm not a prisoner here." My grandfather felt there was more to her imprisonment than a lock and key, but he did not know how to put that feeling into words. He reached into the knapsack and pulled out a package of old gold. Sorry, she reached into the knapsack and pulled out a package of old golds. Something about the pomp with which she set fire to her cigarette made her seem younger than he had thought. "Your pal Creasy already rescued me," she said. "He could have left me lying right there where he found me, half dead with my face in a pile of cinders, right where those Ealing boys red-lighted me." She told him that from the age of 11, she had been traveling in the sideshow of the Entwistle Ealing Brothers Circus out of Peru, Indiana. She had been born a girl in Ocala, Florida, but at puberty, nature had refashioned her with a mustache and chin fuzz. "I went over big for quite a little while, but lately I'm getting all this action from my girl department." She folded her arms under her breasts. "Body's been goofing with me all my life." My grandfather wanted to say that he felt the same way about his brain. That organ whose flights of preposterous idealism were matched only by its reveries of unfettered violence. But he thought it would be wrong to compare his troubles to hers. "I guess that's the reason I started in on the junk," she said. "A hermaphrodite was something. It has a little poetry. There is just no poetry in a bearded lady." She had been nodding, she said, dead to the world, when management at last saw fit to throw her off the circus train as it pulled out of the yard, bound for Altoona. "Creasy found my valise where those assholes had pitched it, conveyed me to these comfortable lodgings." She adjusted her legs and, before she gathered the blanket more tightly, caught my grandfather trying to see into the shadow between them. "Creasy's a bastard, true, but he brings me food and smokes and magazines and candles to read by. The only thing he won't bring me is a fix. Pretty soon it'll be all the same to me anyway. Meantime, he doesn't charge me more rent than I'm willing to pay." My grandfather contemplated the ashes of his plan. He felt she was telling him she was going to die, and that she planned on doing it here, in this room that jumped in the candlelight. Her chest blood was all over a crumpled chamois rag, and on the woolen blanket, and on the lapels of the robe. "Creasy has his point," she said, "and I'm sure the folks on Shunk Street would be happy to know that he's been kind enough to leave me in possession of my virginity, in the technical sense." She squirmed against the cot illustratively. "Railroad men, they are practical fellows, always find a way around." That started her barking into her scrap of chamois, which bloodied it some more. The violence of her coughing shook the blanket loose, baring her legs to my grandfather's inspection. My grandfather felt very sorry for her, but he could not keep his gaze away from the inner darkness of her robe. The spasm passed. She folded the blood-stained part of the chamois into the remnant that was still clean. "Have a look, Shunk Street," she said. She hoisted the hem of the tartan robe, opened her legs, and spread them wide. The pale band of belly, the shock of dark fur, the pink of her labia would endure in his memory, flying like a flag until he died. On the house. He could feel the turmoil in his cheeks, throat, rib cage, loins. He could see that she saw it and was enjoying it. She closed her eyes and raised her hips a little higher. "Go ahead, sweetheart, touch it if you want to." My grandfather found that his lips and tongue could not form a reply. He went over and put his hand against the patch of hair between her legs. He held it there, sampling it with rigid fingers like he was taking a temperature or pulse. The night, the summer, all time and history came to a halt. Her eyes snapped open. She lurched forward and shoved him aside, covering her mouth with the bare hand while the painted one groped for the chamois. My grandfather took a crisp white handkerchief from the back pocket of his cut-off corduroys. He presented her with this evidence of the hopefulness invested in him by his mother every morning afresh when she sent him out into the world. The girl crushed the handkerchief in her fist without seeming to notice it was there. My grandfather watched her body tear itself apart from the inside for what felt like a long time. He worried she might be about to die right then in front of him. Presently, she sighed and fell backward against the cot. Her forehead shone in the light from the stub of candle. She breathed with caution. Her eyes were half open and fixed on my grandfather, but minutes went by before she took notice of him again. "Go home," she said. He eased the day's inviolate handkerchief from her fist. Like a road map, he unfolded it and laid it against her brow. He sealed up the flaps of her robe around her and dragged the awful blanket up to her chin with its babyish dimple. Then he went to the door, where he stopped, looking back at her. The heat of her clung like an odor to his fingertips. "Come back sometime, Shunk Street," she said. "Maybe I'll let you rescue me yet." When my grandfather finally made it home well after dark, there was a patrolman in the kitchen. My grandfather confessed to nothing and provided no information. My great-grandfather, egged on by the patrolman, gave my grandfather a slap across the face to see how he liked it. My grandfather said he liked it fine. He felt he had earned a measure of pain through his failure to rescue the girl. He considered informing the patrolman about her, but she was by her own admission a drug fiend and a whore, and he would rather die than rat her out. Whichever course he chose, he felt he would betray her. So he answered to his nature and said nothing. The patrolman returned to his beat. My grandfather was subjected to lectures, threats, accusations. He bore up under them with his usual stoicism, was sent to bed hungry, and kept the secret of the two-sided girl in the train yard for the next 60 years. The following day, he was put to work in the store, working before and after school on weekdays and all day Sunday. He was not able to make it back to Greenwich Yard until late the following Saturday afternoon after shul. It was getting dark, and the weather had turned wet the night before. Along the tracks, the reflected sky lay pooled between the wooden ties like pans of quicksilver. He knocked on the door of the little house until his hand rang with the pain of knocking. That's it. Thank you. Thank you. So some of you were generous and kind and wrote questions down on these little cards, and I'm going to try to answer some of them. I'll just try to get to the more hostile ones first, if I can. I have not looked at these previously, that is guaranteed. I love the way, that's not going to be hostile, is it? I love the way you're so stupid. No, I love the way you write about clothing. Do you have an eye for fashion? Wait, that's up to you. Or does it take a lot of research? Well, I mean, I'm interested in clothes. I'm interested in what people around me wear. I notice what people are wearing. It's not that I'm noticing how fashionable they are. I'm just noticing what they're wearing. And I notice what people wear in different kinds of places and different parts of the world. And just people's clothing is interesting to me. But I still do have to do research, and especially when I'm doing period stuff and trying to find out, for example, did they have like a corduroy cutoffs? That was something. I wanted to know what my grandfather, quote unquote, would be wearing if he was sort of running around unsupervised, and how, what kind of clothes boys wore when they were just sort of running loose in the streets back then. And, I went and found some photo archives of boys in Philadelphia, actually just old newspaper photos and so on. And I saw a group of boys, and a couple of them had on what looked like corduroy cutoffs, and that was good enough for me. So, but yeah, it's, what people are wearing, it says a lot about them, and we all know that on some level, and that's what fashion is certainly all about, is the language of clothing. But I feel like it's increasingly become a neglected tool that writers employ to quickly let a reader in on what kind of person they're talking about. And you can say a lot just with a particular t-shirt. Okay, maybe this is hostile. So, sort of. I've seen worse. Why do you use the esoteric vocabulary? What effect do you believe you obtain? Or is it affectation? There's 5 SAT words right in that question. It's just English. And there are, maybe that's all I need to say. There are so many words that are being neglected, or just lying around waiting for someone to come along and use them. I feel sorry for them. Everyone just keeps using the same 500 words over and over again. I love words, and all my life I've collecting them in my brain. Just every time I'm reading something, I encounter a word I didn't know before. I take a second or two to try to remember it. I don't always succeed, but I'm carrying around a lot of words at this point, and somebody's got to use them. In the audience tonight, most of the crowd is older than you. I'm kind of in the middle, I'd say. And do you wonder where the younger readers are? Younger readers, woo! I know this is a gloomy time, but I have so many other things I really do have to worry about. I might someday wonder where all the readers are. I hope not, but it was actually kind of a novelty for me, and it really seemed to start with Amazing Adventures of Kavalier and Clay when I started to see people that were older than I am at my readings, and that made me very happy. So I don't know. It's not something I really worry about that much. Maybe I should, though. It's not like opera. Let's put it that way. Like if you love opera, you should be worried, because I don't think there are definitely young people who love opera, but not that many. I don't know any. Let's put it that way. But I'm sure they're out there. Let's see. What do you think of the current state of genre fiction? Do you believe it has evolved in a significant way outside of your own work in the 21st century? I mean, genre fiction, so if you mean science fiction, fantasy, crime fiction, I mean, there's a lot of different genres you could be talking about. I feel like some of them have changed continuously over the course of their history, and I think crime fiction is one of those. Science fiction, genre fiction, fantasy, those have changed over time. They've gotten darker in many ways. More kinds of content are permissible than used to be. It is possible for someone coming just directly out of a particular genre, to have literary aspirations and have those aspirations fulfilled and be acknowledged in a way that I think didn't used to be the case. But I would say I feel like the bigger changes come from the other side, if you will, in that writers that would always have been drawn to trying one of the different genres because that's what they love to read, for example, used to be both actively and implicitly discouraged from doing so. And if you were a quote-unquote serious or literary writer, a lot of times if you wanted to write crime fiction, you had to use a pseudonym, you had to hide it. I mean, like Gore Vidal, for example, wrote some mysteries under the pseudonym of Edgar Box. I don't feel that you have to do that anymore. I feel that the boundaries of what we consider to be literary fiction have broadened and changed more than the boundaries of the genres necessarily have. But I think those have changed too. I think it's good, because I feel that it was never a good situation if you were a lover of science fiction, a lover of fantasy or crime fiction, and you felt like you couldn't write that way and still do the kind of writing you wanted to and be taken seriously. That's essentially a form of forcing people to live in the closet, and that's never a good thing to do. And I think it's a lot easier. A lot of writers have sort of come out of those genre closets in interesting ways. Let's see. Was there something you wrote that didn't connect with readers the way you thought it would? Good or bad? Yes, there are probably many examples. The one that just leaps immediately to mind was not quite about connecting with readers so much as connecting with viewers. And that is a movie that I worked on the screenplay for, called John Carter. When it went, woo! People who clap for John Carter are much fewer than young people in my audience. It was an adaptation of Edgar Rice Burroughs' classic, The Stories of John Carter of Mars. The original title of my screenplay and of the film project was John Carter of Mars. The studio in question, that I will not name, but a mouse is their symbol, or certain people at the studio decided that John Carter of Mars was a bad title for a movie. I will tell you their rationale. The last 11 movies that came out that had the word Mars in the title were all flops. That's a direct quote. No one in the room, we were in this room when this was announced, all the various creative people and studio people, and no one thought to point out that also all of those movies were bad. Which I felt was like more germane than having the word Mars in the title. But, and I thought having the title be John Carter made it sound like it was going to be a movie about an insurance actuary or something, but they didn't listen to me about that either. And it was, I loved those books as a kid. They meant so much to me. I loved Edgar Rice Burroughs so much. I have this manila folder that was where I kept all my writings when I was 10, 11, 12 years old. Just whenever I wrote something, I tore it out of the legal pad and stuck it into this manila envelope. And on the front of the envelope, it says, in felt tip marker in many different colors, Mike Burroughs, in quotes, Chabon. That's how I referred to myself. So I really, those books meant so much to me, and they meant so much to the director, Andrew Stanton, who also brought us Finding Nemo and Wall-E and Finding Dory and Bug's Life? No, thank you. The other people working on it, we all cared so much, we tried to do our best, and it did not connect with viewers at all, and it became kind of like a legendary failure, mentioned often in the same breath, with slightly less horror than Ishtar and Heaven's Gate. That did not feel good. And I was shocked. I mean, I shouldn't have been shocked after the whole taking Mars out of the title thing. But, I mean, it's not Kurosawa or something, but it's a pretty good movie. It's fun. I think go see, if you haven't seen it, give it a try. It is set on Mars, and there are giant green men with 4 arms. I'm just warning you ahead of time. How do you pronounce Kavalier? There's cookies in it for the correct answer. Wait, if I'm correct, I get cookies? How could I not be correct? I made it up. But okay, I expect my cookies because that is the correct. No, it's weird. It's partly a problem with bad writing on my part. There's a sentence in there somewhere in that book where it says someone mispronounces Joe Cavalier's name to rhyme with the French singer famous for, Louise. So it's like people think, oh, Chevalier, so it's Cavalier, but it actually says they rhymed it, they mispronounced it to rhyme it, and I don't know, maybe that's just too complicated, and when people read it, it just scans as like, that's how you say it, if you're reading very quickly, and your mind is addled by all the cookies you've been eating. Anyway, yeah, it's Kavalier, and I just was in Nashville some period of time in the recent past that has all merged into one giant blur, except for a few highlights, and one of those highlights was being at Parnassus Books in Nashville, Tennessee. Woo! And that bookstore is owned and operated in part by the wonderful Ann Patchett, the wonderful novelist Ann Patchett, and she's incredible. I love her. And I was with her at the McDowell Colony a long time ago, before any of us really knew who either I or Ann Patchett was. She had published her first 2 books, and I had published my first 2 books, or 3, and we hit it off, and then she had to leave in the middle of her stay to go to a funeral in Pittsburgh, which I have connections to as well. And the funeral, and I was in the early stages of writing that book, and the funeral was a man, the deceased was a relative of her friend, and his name was Kavalier. And, but I spelled it wrong, because it was spelled with no I, and I didn't know that. So I just spelled it like our word, Kavalier, with a K on the front, and that became Joe Cavalier's last name. So it's thanks to Ann Patchett that it's not called like Schicklgruber and Clay. Do you think fiction is the most effective prose form to convey the truth? Well, there's a problem with that last word, of course. What is it? But, fiction is not necessarily the most effective prose form for conveying the facts, but I think it is definitely the most effective prose form for conveying a truth, whether that truth is the writer's truth or the truth that the writer has determined is the truth of the characters, which then is probably also the writer's truth on some level as well. When people with Moonglow, when people ask me, it's a fake memoir. pretends to be a memoir, it's really a novel. When people ask me how much of this is really true, the answer to that question is Moonglow. Like 440 pages it took me to answer that question, because what you're asking is in families, how much truth is there in the stories that families tell about themselves, in the stories that parents tell their children, that grandparents tell their children? How much of that is true? How much of it is accurate? How much is factual? How much of it really happened? And anyone who has siblings and you've grown to a certain age, and you know those moments where you start remembering something that happened and get into an argument about it because one of you says, Dad wasn't there. And you're like, yes, Dad was. Like, no, he wasn't. I remember he wasn't there, blah, blah, blah. Here's my reasoning why Dad wasn't there. And then my brother says, well, I know he was there because blah, blah, blah. Currently we have no technological solution to that problem. That could be changing. And that will be fun, especially in marriages. And you'll be like, could we roll the tape on that, honey? I think I would turn out to be so much more right than I currently am. But in any case, I don't know. The truth is that the truth in families is a very slippery thing. And it's not because people are lying. Sometimes it is. In some people in my family, it definitely is. But even unconsciously, unintentionally, we warp things. We give things a spin. Sometimes, depending on what kind of person you are, sometimes to make this in a self-deprecating way, to sort of you portray yourself as a kind of a perennial loser in all the stories that you tell, that's the case with so much the case with my childhood reminiscences to my children that they have begged me to stop telling them because it makes them feel too sad. Like every story. And now if I open my mouth to say, that reminds me, and they're like, please. It's like, okay, who beat you up? And like, no, I was just gonna say it. And like, no, we just don't want to hear it. Someone broke your glasses, or you had no friends. And my youngest child refuses to read Peanuts comics, even though his other siblings did, because Charlie Brown just makes him feel too sad. And then he just told me just a couple days before I left on this book tour that he thinks that I'm like Charlie Brown. Those people have always been associated in his mind. In any case, sometimes that's the way you tell stories. Sometimes some people tell stories to make themselves look big, to make themselves look more important, to make themselves look more central to an incident than they really were. And they're not doing it. And the thing is, if you tell the story enough times, you forget that's what you're doing. And what you actually remember is what you've been saying all these years. That's your memory. It's indistinguishable from your memory. Memory is so fragile and so liable to fictionalizing, that it might even be the case that it simply is a fiction itself. Like memory is a kind of fiction, and unless you have documentary evidence to support it, you're probably on shifting ground to some degree or another, depending. Of course, some people have fantastic memories, and then when we test those memories against the facts, we see that they have amazing memories, but that's rare. Yes. All right, thank you. Let's see. Well, here's a question about my real relationship to 10th and Shunk in Philadelphia, but I think I answered that one, didn't I? Let's see. Last one. Okay, your wife is famous for saying she loved you more than children. Would you say the same? Did I love myself more than I love my children? Sometimes. I mean, you know how kids are. First of all, if my wife were here, she would say what she said to me. I think it may well have been the same conversation which my son informed me that I remind him of Charlie Brown. Or when he pictures me as a child, he pictures Charlie Brown, is what he actually said. it might have been that same conversation that my wife said she now loves our dog more than she loves either me or the children. It's funny. She was, and this is a reference to this essay that Ayala, my wife, wrote many years ago now, in which she said essentially that, but it was hyperbole. It was intended as hyperbole. She was trying to make a point, and the point she was trying to make was that she felt that her feelings for me, her love for me, was the center of what she felt about everything, and that the children were not ancillary, but were satellites to that, that the center of everything for her was the marriage, and the children were a kind of, inevitably, in a sense, subsidiary to that, and she felt that was, she felt anomalous in that way, and she worried that might mean there was something that made her a bad mother on that score. And when she wrote that, I didn't necessarily know if I agreed, or I didn't necessarily have it sort of sorted out in my mind at that point. And in fact, I was so caught up in just the welter of having 4 children and being married and trying to make the marriage work and trying to make all the kids not die and and all that stuff, that it just it was too much of a undifferentiated mess for me at that point to really know exactly what I thought on that score. And I just hadn't really looked at it that way. And I will say that over time, now our kids are getting older. We have one who's 22 and has a boyfriend, and that she seems pretty happy with, and even who knows what will happen there, but eventually you can see what's going to be happening. And it's true. I have a 19-year-old son, then a 15 and a 13-year-old, and I see now very clearly that if the marriage isn't the center of everything, then when the kids go, there's nothing. And that doesn't seem right to me. And I actually do feel, I've come around fully to her original point of view of it, not more or less, but what's in the middle. And I think she's actually shifted a little bit over time, and it's really all about the labradoodle. Anyway, I thank you for these questions. I thank you for your time and attention. Thank you.